everyone and welcome back to the world's easiest layouts crash course for UI UX designers in 2026. This is going to be an incredible video where we're going to cover absolutely everything you need to know in the entire huge land of layouts in UI UX design. We're going to take a deep dive into layouts, which is one of the most misunderstood, easiest, and also most important parts of UI UX design. And this is going to be super duper fun, so let's just get started. Layouts are the foundation of absolutely every screen you ever see in your entire journey on the internet. When a layout is strong, everything else is easy to use, but when a layout is weak, the whole experience clutters and falls down in just 15 minutes. When a layout is weak, you can't have good colors and good fonts save it, which is why it is my honor to talk to you about layouts, the most easiest, important, and misunderstood topic of UI UX design. Today we're going to learn why good layouts work, what are the things that make a good layout, how to create good layouts on purpose in your own UI UX designs. We'll cover everything from the basic ideas behind layout to the technical tools you need to the common layout patterns used in real products and the advanced concepts that turn an okay designer into a great one. And by the end, you won't just feel like this is a good layout, you will know exactly how to create a good layout on purpose for any UI, for any use case. In this video, we have 6 modules. We'll start with the fundamentals and slowly move towards the most advanced parts of layouts and UI UX design. So grab your coffee, open up your design tool, whether it's Figma or Penpot, because we are about to go in deep and this is going to be super duper fun. Let's just get started. I want you to think about the last time you visited a website or app and felt completely lost, like you had no idea what was going on there. The page was chaotic and you left frustrated. 9 times out of 10, a bad layout is the reason why. Layouts aren't just decoration. Layouts are actual communication of how this entire content is supposed to be structured on a really complicated web page. On the flip side, think about an experience where you went to the site, everything was smooth, it was just a super cool smooth ride, you knew exactly where things were, exactly where to take them, and it was an easy time being around on the site. That probably was also caused by a good layout. Layouts literally make or break experiences in UI UX design, which is why they're super duper important. A layout is literally how carefully and how well you place things on a paper or a screen so that people can understand and retrieve it. A layout is carefully placed. It's not random. You choose where everything goes and put into a layout. And if you're not choosing where your things are going, you're still choosing where your things are going. You're just not doing a very good job at choosing where things are going. A layout is an arrangement of how things sit next to each other. And it's not just about one picture or one single word. It's about how the entirety of everything works together. A layout is a visual element and it includes all of the visual elements that you see on your screen. Words, pictures, buttons, icons, empty spaces, lines, everything. It is a defined space, which is a very specific limited area wherein everything kind of happens. It has its edges or limits like the screen of a phone or a screen of a computer, but the entire area of the layout is predefined and really specific in how much it is available. A layout communicates information not just to look pretty, but to help people understand something quickly and easily. Layouts also have a very guiding behavior wherein they guide the user with everything that they go through, so the user knows what to do. If a button is big and in the center, people will click it. If a button is really small and in a corner, people might not see it. If a menu is easy to see, people will use it. And if a menu is nowhere to be seen or found and it's kind of at the bottom of a scrolly wheel that goes down for 10 straight minutes, most probably no one is going to be using it. Where you place things changes how people act when they interact with your site. Now let's talk about why layout is the basic of every single thing you'd make in a UI design. Typography, color, and images are all important, but they all sit inside a layout. A beautiful font in a messy layout is hard to read. A great photo in a messy layout feels crowded. Layout is like the container that holds everything together. If the container is bad, nothing is going to work. And if the container is good, it can make things that weren't too good still look good, still positioned well, still placed cleanly. Layouts have 3 main jobs in UI design: organization, hierarchy, and flow. Organization is just how you group things together and how you place them inside of a specific layout, turning a messy scene into a clean screen. Hierarchy. Layouts show what is most important. It tells the user what to look at first, then second, then third. Flow. Layout guides the eyes across the screen and it helps people move through content in the right order so they can reach their goal easily. Now we're getting to the most important part of part 1 of this video. I call these the big 5 rules of layouts and absolutely every good UI UX designer knows them. If you remember nothing from this video, just remember this one thing and you'll be golden. Layouts have 5 main principles that you might want to know about in their entirety. Number 1, visual hierarchy. Not everything in a screen is equally important, and a good layout makes that extremely clear. We show importance of things in layout using relative sizes, contrast, color, positioning, or white space. Size. We show importance in a layout using size because bigger things will feel more important. Contrast, because higher contrast will stand out more. Color, because bright bold colors will grab attention, like the weird bright pink that I have on my face and my hands and everywhere for some reason, which is is definitely catching your attention right now. Position, because things at the top and center of the screen will get looked at first. And white space, because more space around something makes it feel important, and this is such a common rule in all of UI UX design. Speaking of the pink that is on my face and everywhere, this is a gift from all of my friends on the beautiful day called Holi. If you don't know what that is, maybe Google it. Point is, all of this dye is just permanent and it's not going to leave for another 2 weeks. So we're stuck with a pink Vira for now. Think about a newspaper. The main headline is huge and at the top. The caption is small and you never confuse them. That's literally hierarchy working in real life. In UI design, the main button, which is the buy now or the sign up button, should stand out the most, and extra information should stand out less. Legal text should stand out the least, because legal text, warnings, things like that, just extremely off-putting when you're trying to put out the best first impression, even if they are legally important. They should stand out the least. People who want to search for them can look for them. People who are new to your site exploring what your product does don't necessarily need to have the biggest contract terms and conditions in the hugest font in the biggest hierarchical font style, if you know what I mean. Hierarchy tells users where to look first, second, and third. Number 2, alignment. Alignment means things line up with each other. Nothing should feel randomly picked. Items line up, your eyes actually move smoothly across a screen. Whereas when things are slightly off and it feels messy, our eyes have a really hard time moving across the screen and finding where the next thing is supposed to be. Common alignment types include left alignment, right alignment, center alignment, edge alignment, and justified alignment too sometimes. The simple rule with alignment is always this: if two things are close together, they should either line up intentionally or they should not align intentionally. There is nothing in the middle. You can't have 2 pixels of spacing saying maybe they're aligned, maybe they're not. Uncertainty is not welcome when we're talking about alignment. When you're talking about alignment, either something is clearly lined up or it does not belong there. It belongs in another line and they are not lined up together on purpose. Everything is intentional, and that's one of the core principles of UX design too. Everything you're doing needs to be intentional, and that's why alignment is such an important topic in layouts in UX design. Almost aligned things are the biggest beginner mistakes. I don't want to see them today. I don't want to see them 10 years in the future. You as a UX designer have absolutely no business almost aligning things. Either align things on purpose or don't align them. There is no middle. There just isn't. Proximity. Things that belong together should be close together, and things that do not belong together should have space between them. Our brains automatically group things that are near each other, so it's really important to be intentional about the proximity of things when you're doing UX design. For example, a label should be close to its input field. A caption should sit right under its image. A button should be close to the thing it affects. Good spacing creates a pattern, bad spacing breaks patterns. And when the pattern repeats itself, users know how to go through your screen, how to understand your content faster, better, and easier. Next, we're talking about balance. Balance means spreading visual weight across the entire layout. A balanced screen is very stable and easy to look at. An unbalanced screen is quite uncomfortable and just all over the place. And there are different types of balance: symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance. When you have symmetrical balance going on, both sides look the same and it feels very formal and very stable. But when you have got asymmetrical balance going on, both sides are different but they still feel equal, because even when it is asymmetrical, it is still balance. For example, a big image on one side and smaller text blocks on the other side. And this is very, very common in modern design, you guys, so don't be confused when things aren't always symmetrically balanced. Balance is important. Both symmetrical and asymmetrical balance are almost always welcome. Balance is about visual weight, not size, meaning a small dark object can balance a light but large one. And this isn't about having 32 pixels versus 300 pixels. This is about visual weight and how heavy it looks to the eyes, and that is almost always something you can best tell through your own eyes and not through some random pixel values scribbled across a screen. Number 5, white space or negative space. White space is empty space around things, and many people think it's wasted space, but it's actually not. It is the thing that gives all of the content of the screen a lot of ease in terms of reading. White space is breathing room, and it makes content easier to read and makes designs feel premium. If you've ever looked at fancy designs and thought why your designs don't look like it, white space might have had a lot to do with it. It makes content easier to read and makes a design feel premium. There are 2 types of white space: macro white space and micro white space. Macro white space is the big gaps in between objects, between sections and around cards, and micro white space is the small gaps between lines of text and inside buttons. So it's really, really small and really, really in minute places. More white space makes the content feel important, makes the design feel clean, and makes the product feel high quality in nature. Crowded designs will always feel cheap and spacious designs always feel premium. When you're unsure on whether you should add white space versus not add white space, it's almost always a better idea to add white space. These 5 principles, hierarchy, alignment, proximity, balance, and white space, are the foundation of every layout decision you will ever make. These are the 5 main components that are going to make any design work for you instead of against you. Alright, next I want to talk about grid systems. This is the second module of today's video. If a layout is the foundation of UI design, grids are the structure that keep everything strong and organized. So what is a grid really? A grid is a set of invisible rows and columns or invisible lines that help you place things neatly on a page. Users don't see the grid, they only feel the actual effects of the grid. They only feel that the design looks clean, balanced, and organized. Think of it like the frame inside of a house. You, as the person who lives in the house, don't exactly know what the frame looks like or where it exists exactly, but you feel the consequences of the frame itself, meaning the house feels clean and very, very in place. So let's now talk about the main parts of a grid that you absolutely need to know as you're heading into layouts in UX design. Columns. Columns are the vertical sections of a page. In a 12-column grid, the page is divided into 12 equal vertical strips. Designers will use these strips to decide how wide things should be. Gutters. Gutters are the space between columns. They stop content from touching and looking crowded. Without gutters, everything would feel super squished together. Gutters provide white space in a grid, which is why they're such an important part, because white space, as I said earlier, is a very, very critical part of no matter what you're doing. Margins. Margins are the space on the left and right edges of the screen, and they keep content from sticking to the sides of the screen. Margins will give your design breathing room. They keep content from sticking to the sides of the page, just like gutters keep content from sticking inside of each other. Rows or modules are horizontal divisions. Just like columns, you've got rows as well. Rows and columns work together to give you a real grid, and inside of this grid you can place things neatly as you need to as a designer. You'll see 12-column grids used absolutely everywhere in UI design, and one very natural question that comes up with that is, Veera, why are every grid layouts based on 12-column grids? Why not 8-column grids? Why not 13-column grids? 12-column grids are used the most out of any other number of grids because 12 is a very flexible number. You can divide 12 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 and 12 itself and still have a lot of fun with those without getting into weird little remainder numbers. Big design systems like Bootstrap, Foundation, and Material Design are all using 12-column grids in the backend because of how flexible the number 12 becomes in actual design day to day. 12-column grids give you a lot of structure and flexibility in UI design. Grids themselves, in fact, give a lot of structure and flexibility to your entire design, which is exactly why, even when they're not visible, they are driving so much of what clear UI design looks like across the internet. See, now there isn't just one type of grid, there are a couple of types of grids, and they're really, really cool, so I want to talk about what they are. The first kind of grid that I want to talk about today is the column grid. The column grid is the most common grid in UI design, and it divides the page into vertical strips or columns. And you can make your content stretch across as many columns as you want, from a 1-column grid to a 4-column grid to an 8-column grid, or even a 12-column grid. And depending on what your content is going to be at the moment, you can decide how many columns you need to give this specific piece of content. So for example, a hero image might use all 12 columns. A 3-feature card might use 4 columns each. And a text section might use 6 columns on the left and 6 on the right. Everything lines up in the same vertical lines, which is the entire point of having a grid. And that is exactly what makes your layout feel clean and connected. The next kind of grid that I want to talk about is the modular grid. The modular grid is used in modern design way too much, and it adds rows to your standard column grid. You have a grid made of small boxes in cases of modular grids, and it looks like a graph paper. And it's great for dashboards, e-commerce sites, news or magazine layouts. And this is exactly what makes modular grids so powerful and so used in modern design. A baseline grid focuses on the horizontal lines of your layout, and it works by taking care of the line spacing or the line height of your main body text. It makes sure text lines up across columns, spacing feels nice and evenly spread from top to bottom, and the layout has a steady vertical rhythm. This idea comes from print design to modern web design. In digital design, it's harder to apply perfectly, but designers will still use it, and the principle, more importantly, still matters. Consistent vertical spacing creates harmony, and this is exactly the entire driving point of this kind of grids. The compound grid. The compound grid creates multiple kinds of grids in a singular layout and makes it work together. For example, you could have a 3-column grid layered over a 4-column grid, and that would be a compound grid. This allows for more creative, asymmetrical, modern designs. It is a powerful tool, but it is a bit of an advanced tool if you're just getting started. When used carefully, it creates dynamic and modern layouts, but if overused, it can very easily become confusing. So this is something you might want to keep in mind when using compound grids. Each kind of grid gives you a structure to work with in your entire UI, and the more complicated your UI gets, the more important it is for you as a designer to get your grids in order. Now let's talk about one of the most important tools in UI design itself, the 8-point grid system. This is the system used by most modern design teams in the world right now, and it means all spacings and sizes are multiples of the number 8. So instead of random numbers, you'll always end up using 8, 16, 24, 32, and so on. Sometimes designers will also use smaller steps of 4, which goes from 4, 8, 12, 16, and so on. But almost always the 8-point grid is very sturdy on using multiples of the number 8. Now you might ask why the number 8 specifically and not something else like 7 or 9. That is a great question. We use 8 because 8 works perfectly with different screen sizes. On a normal screen, 8 points equals to 8 pixels. On a 2x retina screen, 8 points equals to 16 pixels. And on a 3x retina screen, 8 points equals to 24 pixels. All whole numbers, no weird fractions. When you use random numbers like 17 or 19 pixels, you get blurry edges because you have fractions inside of pixels now in your actual hardware monitor, which is a bit of a problem if you want your things to look really smooth. Using 8 keeps everything sharp and clean. So now what does this look like when you're using it in real UI UX design? In real UI UX design, instead of having a button height of 42 pixels, you're going to have a 40 pixel, 48 pixel or 56 pixel button height specifically. Instead of having a card padding of 18 pixels, you're going to have a card padding of exactly 16 pixels or 24 pixels specifically. Instead of having a section gap of 70 pixels, you're going to have a very specific section gap of either 64 pixels or 72 pixels or 80 pixels because they're all multiples of 8 at the end of the day, which is what it means to be following the 8-point grid principle in practice. And it might seem strict, but when you start using the consistency, it can be the most powerful tool in UX design you ever end up using. And now let's talk about why that even matters. Why does every design space follow the same rule? Every design space follows the same rule because it helps the designer work faster, no matter what team you're in. It helps developers understand exactly what to build. And it helps the interface feel balanced and smooth. Instead of saying add about 20 pixels of space, you can say add 2 spacing units, and that can be as clear as day right then, right there. That's clearer, cleaner, and far more professional. Over time, this creates a visual rhythm that users can physically feel, even if they don't understand exactly why this thing feels so smooth and so easy to use. Now let's talk about the spacing scale. Many designers will take the 8-point grid system and even the 4-point system that we just talked about and take it a little bit further. And they'll create entire scales out of these 4 and 8 number-based numerical gaps. For example, 4 is going to be extra small text. 8 pixels is going to be extra small. 12 is going to be small. 16 is medium. 24 is large. 32 is extra large. 48 is extra large. 64 is jumbo. And this is going to be the way they're going to be continuing their own internal spacing scheme inside of their design systems and inside of their own UI design projects. Instead of random numbers, you'll name your number system gaps and you'll use them accordingly. This will make communication between designers and developers much smoother, especially when you're talking about really specific values on really specific parts of a screen. Alright, so up until now we talked about the 8-point system and the 12-column grid. Now, how do you make these things practical? Why would you have things like these working in the first place? And since we've already talked about the 8-point system, I also want to cover the 12-column grid now because it's super duper effective, and yet you still don't know what it's effective about, and that's personally killing me on the inside. How do you use a 12-column grid to make your layout decisions? Let's just see right now. Let's talk about screen sizes now, or breakpoints. When you have a desktop, it takes a lot of space, and that is usually 12 columns wide. When you have a tablet, it takes a little bit less space compared to a desktop, and that can be like 8 columns wide. When you have a phone, it's much less wider, and that's almost always 4 columns wide. So how do you use these column widths in context for your actual UIs? Here are some common 12-column grid patterns, which is a full width layout. This is used for hero sections, big images, navigation bars, and footers. And it grabs the maximum attention and almost always signals the starting of the page or the ending of the page. Now let's talk about the 6-6 split. We just talked about the 12 columns, all wide used completely. Now let's talk about the 6-6 split inside of the 12 column grid. Sometimes you can take your grid and split it into 6 and 6 half and half columns instead of using the whole 12 column wide space at once. This is super useful when you're making your site responsive, meaning useful for different screen sizes, in which case you can have the whole thing be visible at once at a tablet or a desktop. But when you make it smaller for your mobiles, when you make it responsive, when the site changes to look the way it would on mobile, you can stack those two columns on top of each other because mobiles will always give you less width. Mobiles will be vertical when your users are using them, and you can stack the two columns on top of each other because you have more scrolling area on a mobile, and you can kind of work with all of the content with lesser width provided to you at once. Here is what a responsive two column layout looks like. This is great for an image plus text, or two different products, or two equal pieces of content used in the same screen at once. Now let's talk about 4-4-4, the 3 column layout. Here is the 3 column layout, which basically divides your 12 column grids into 3 separate columns, each of 4 column widths. And it is perfect for featured lists, icon sections offering 3 different products, or sections where you're offering 3 different pricing plans. This communicates you've given equal importance to all of the 3 products used here. Alright, let's now talk about the 3-3-3 column grid. So this is where you take your 12 column grid, divided into 4 equal sections, and it's very useful when you're showing product grids, team member cards, elements of the equal importance used in the single screen together. And it is often used with repeating items, and it usually shows us that you're giving equal importance to 4 or more smaller pieces of content. Now let's talk about asymmetrical layouts. You will have asymmetrical layouts that will be in all sorts of different numerical variations. So for example, you could have 8 and 4 column based layouts. You can have asymmetrical layouts which are basically 8 column wide and 4 column wide used together. You can also have 9 and 3 column wide layouts, which are very different numbers, don't really follow a mathematical pattern, but they are still used together because something new in the layout demands it. Almost all complicated sites are using some or the other form of this asymmetrical layout pattern at least once, because this is exactly what brings an unexpected novelty into your normal looking UI. This is often great for a blog post and a sidebar, a main article and supporting content, hero text and smaller visual text. The main rule of thumb with all asymmetrical layouts is the main content needs to take up more space, needs to have the bigger number in your layout divisions. Main content should always take more columns than the secondary content. 8-4 splits in layouts say the main side of the story is the left column, and 6-6 splits in the layout say both of these are of equal importance, and that's something you need to keep in mind when you're the person deciding the hierarchy of your layout. In 6-6 splits, both sides matter completely equally, and both columns are being used to communicate equal meaning. Alright, now I want to talk about something that many designers in the beginning get wrong, and they realize that a long time after they're already into their projects, and it takes a little while for people to realize this if they're just starting out. Grids are not prisons for your UI, they are guides. And this is something that people confuse all the time, because it almost feels like if you ever have one thing going out of the grid, that's you breaking a rule. It's not breaking a rule if you know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. Grids are excellent ways to guide you on exactly how to align your content for the most part. But if you're being intentional and if you want to highlight something, make it intentionally be out of place so that it can be highlighted as the thing that stands out inside of the UI, then it's a good idea once or twice to break out of the grid very intentionally. Good designers will always stick to grids. That's never been a question of debate, but great designers will know when to eventually selectively break out of the grid a couple of times so that your layout actually stands out. And it's not a bad idea to break out of your grid if you're using it for emphasis and if you're using it intentionally. Good designers will use a grid for structure, and great designers will know when to bend that structure for a little bit of extra purpose and extra flavor and extra highlighting of the right content. This is what you need to be thinking about. When you're making something responsive, which means you're making sure it scales and is available smoothly across a desktop and also a normal mobile, the 12 column grid gets very useful. And this is how it scales inside of responsive alignment. So let's talk about spacing, rhythm and density now. We already talked about the idea of white space, but now I want to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more advanced in the whole concept of spacing. And I want to talk about taking spacing, making spacing happen, organizing it and using it for different purposes inside of your UI. There is 2 levels of basic spacing going on across UIs. Macro spacing, which is the spacing between things, between major sections, between major cards in a grid, between major navigation items. This is called large scale spacing too, and it controls how open or crowded a page feels inside of the page itself. The next spacing is micro spacing or component spacing. This is the small spacing inside of components, like the padding inside of a button, or the space between two different icons, the space between two different lines of text or an input and a text. This is just the really small short pieces of micro level detailed spacing. Small spacing is what actually affects the real usability and readability of your site. Both spacings are very important when you have to influence meaning in a site. Both spacings have to work together. You need to have perfect button padding and good spacing between sections. You can't just say I'll do good button padding but my section spacing can feel a little bit off. That doesn't work. Both of these need to make sense for a good UI to function properly, and it is your responsibility to make sure both of them are taken care of. You could have perfect button padding and unequal spacing between sections and your UI would feel off. Like it just would. You can't make up for that. You can't make it work if you don't have perfect spacing going on. Great design has consistent spacing everywhere, no matter what we're talking about, big and small. Alright, now I want to talk about a really common mistake beginners make in UI UX design: not knowing the difference between margin and padding. This is my favorite question in the whole world when it comes to spacing and UX design. Margin is the space outside of a container that surrounds the area of the container and the amount of area the section takes outside of it. Padding is the space inside a container, which means the distance between a button's border and the button's text is going to be held by the padding. If components look too closely crammed up inside of each other, it's probably a spacing issue. If the insides of a component are really crammed together and kind of like this, you need to increase the padding. But if in the entire page different sections are kind of cramped together like this, you need to increase the margin, which is the spacing outside of a container around the container, and which is the white space of the container. Margin and padding are two really different things. You need to realize what they are. Even if you're going to be a UI UX designer, this is still a super duper relevant topic. And if you're going to be doing developer handoffs, this becomes a super duper important topic. If you're going to be writing code at any point of time, margin and padding are two different things, and you will have to learn them in box models as well. So that's kind of why margin and padding and the distinction between them is super important. Getting spacing is not an easy task. It does require a little bit of struggle, but once you get familiar with the 8-point spacing system, which is again multiples of 8, spacing becomes much easier, especially if you're starting out as a beginner. When spacing isn't random, it creates rhythm, and rhythm is exactly what makes good UIs stick in the long run. Now let's talk about vertical rhythm and spatial relationships. Vertical rhythm is a very important topic in UI UX design, and it sometimes confuses me why people are just not talking about it. Vertical rhythm means having a consistent level of spacing as you go down a page. Think about music. You only like music when the beat is constant and actually continues through the entirety in the background, no matter what the vocals are. So the beat is always going to be very rhythmic. In a similar fashion, your UIs need to have rhythmic spacing between each section as you go down a page. That cannot change, and that's exactly what makes your spacing, what makes your UI seem consistent, feel consistent, and have a lot of ease in terms of usability. When vertical spacing is organized and clear and equal, the whole page feels organized and easy to go through. When spacing is messed up and when spacing is jumbled up and random, the page isn't calm or organized or easy to read, and it becomes an entirely messy user experience, even as designers can't explain why. Now let's talk about how do you create vertical rhythm, because if vertical rhythm is so important, we need to learn as designers how to implement vertical rhythm inside of our UIs. Let's start with your line height. Let's say the main line height in your piece of body text has a line height of 24 pixels. Now every spacing that you do has to be in multiples of 24, which means the next spacings that you will implement anywhere in the entirety of your UI as you progress down the page has to be 24 or 48 or 72, just verticals of 24. Instead of going to random numbers like 37 pixels or 53 pixels, you're going to be really specific in making sure 24 and its multiples are the only numbers used in spacing, no matter where you're going across the page. Vertical rhythm is more than just spacing and numbers. Vertical rhythm is also about meaning. Things that belong together should be closer. Things that don't belong together should be farther apart. This connects back to the principles that we were just talking about in module 1, more specifically the principle of proximity. For example, in a form like this one, the label to input has to be 8 pixels of spacing, which is very closely related. The next spacing interval is going to be when one field group is put next to the other field group. Now the spacing has to be 24 pixels. The next spacing has to be from the form to the next page section, and this has to be another multiple of the same number, which is either 48 or more pixels of spacing weight. Different spacing means different relationships between objects. Your spacing is going to be what tells the user these elements belong together and these elements don't belong together, really specifically. Vertical rhythm is invisible. Once you start learning how to design with vertical rhythm, you will not only feel it, it will be the thing that superpowers your design journey as you're going through the wonderful process of UI UX design. Now we're talking about information density. As you go across the screen, there is a very important decision you need to make as a UI UX designer. What is the information density going to be? And there is no right answer. There is no specific information densities that is the best one or the worst one. Information density just means how much content do you show on one screen. Different products need different levels of information density. And here are the three main types of information density used: compact density, comfortable density, or spacious density. Compact density shows a lot of elements on the screen at once. It is used with small elements, tight spacing, and many items on a screen. And it's common in the Bloomberg terminal, enterprise dashboards, code editors, data heavy tools, and the users are almost always professionals. They want speed and efficiency far more than they want visual comfort, which is why compact density is useful for them. The next density is comfortable density. This is the middle ground between clean spacing and readable text with breathing room to go along with that. Examples include the Gmail default view, the Google Docs, most productivity apps, which balance efficiency with ease of use. Most consumer products will almost always use comfortable density. And the third kind of density is spacious density. Spacious density focuses on large images, generous padding, and fewer elements per screen. For example, the Apple site. This feels premium, calm, and luxurious and works best for high-end brands and simple products. One huge mistake that I see beginners making all the time is they will choose density depending on what looks good. That is the biggest blunder you can make inside of your journey, because spacing and spacing density isn't about what looks good, it's about what this tool solves. All of these three kinds of densities are tools depending on what product you're building, and you need to be looking at the context and making an intelligent choice, not just what looks pretty in the moment. Density is a product decision, not just a visual decision. A developer tool with too much spacing will feel slow and frustrating, and a luxury brand with cramped spacing feels really cheap. And interestingly, density can change even inside of the product. Inside of one single product, you can have two different kinds of density at once. For example, the data would be compact, the landing page would be spacious, and the settings page might be denser than the home page even. Good designers will match density to the situation, and great designers understand that density affects how a product feels and how efficiently it works. Density isn't just spacing, it's strategy. So you need to be really careful with where you're using density. Now let's talk about typographic spacing. If spacing is everywhere and it matters most in text, then text is the main content that most UI designers work with. And if your text spacing is wrong, the whole experience suffers automatically. Here are three key things to understand when we're talking about typographic spacing: line height or leading, letter space or tracking, and measure or line length. Let's talk about line height first. Line height is the vertical space between lines of text. And if lines are too close together, your text will feel cramped and hard to read. For body text, 1.5 to 1.7 line height is usually ideal. For headings, 1.1 to 1.3 works best. Headings are short, so slightly tighter spacing will always feel stronger. And small changes in the line height can dramatically improve readability. Now let's talk about letter spacing or tracking. Letter spacing is the space between individual letters, and not for almost all body text, your default letter spacing is going to be fine. But if you want to adjust it by a really small number of pixels. For all caps body text, you might want a little bit more tracking to improve readability. For very large headings like 80 pixel ones, you often reduce tracking to make them compact and close together and really looking strong. This removing a little bit of spacing is called negative tracking. Large letters look too far apart if you don't tighten them together. Too much negative tracking can make a text feel cramped, so this is a very common beginner mistake and you have to be really careful about it. Now let's talk about measure or line length. Measure means how long each line of text is. 45 to 75 characters per line is the average when it comes to measure, and around 60 characters is the ideal measure. If your lines are too short, your eyes struggle to find the next line, and reading feels really choppy. And if the lines are too long, you'll lose your place and just forget which line you were actually on, start different lines at random times. So in real life UI design, at a 16 pixel font size, body text should usually be 600 pixels to 800 pixels wide. And if your 12 column grid made text too wide on big screens, use max width, which limits the maximum width a container can take. You can also use 8 or 10 column grids instead of 12 column grids, and add padding if your 12 column grid is still too wide. Don't let your text stretch endlessly across the screen simply because your grid said so. You are a designer with a brain, and you need to be looking at really careful blocks of text and how easy or difficult they are to read. So now let's talk about why we were talking about all of this in the first place. This isn't just about looking nice. Research from the Nielsen-Norman group shows that proper line height, proper line length, and proper letter spacing will directly improve your reading speed and comprehension. And this is functional in design, not just decoration. So when your typographic spacing is correct, reading feels effortless. Gliding through your product feels like a really easy task to do. And your whole interface feels very thoughtful. Good typography is invisible, and yet bad typography is completely impossible to ignore. Which is why good typography is not something that will jump out of every page and tell you, hi, I'm good typography. But if the typography is bad, you'll automatically automatically know this typography is bad. And that's kind of the little mindset I work with when working with typography, and that's what I want you to work with the next time you're working with a lot of text. Welcome to module 4. Now we're going to be talking about responsive and adaptive layouts. In case you don't know what the word responsive means when you create a site for a wide screen like a desktop, it can automatically transfer and look and shift and adapt to serve all of that content perfectly well on a smaller width device like a mobile. And this isn't just limited to from desktop to mobile, this also goes the other way. Mobile first responsiveness is basically creating a site for a mobile screen which can automatically adapt to take up the space and to bring out the exact content very, very nicely in a desktop. And now you might be confused over here a little bit. Shouldn't we be able to scale content automatically? Why do we need to interrupt into the ways the computer works? Why do we need to change the way of layout works from a mobile to a desktop? That's a very genuine question. And I feel like this is the perfect point to answer that question, because mobiles have a wider vertical area and a smaller horizontal area, and desktops have a wider horizontal area and a smaller vertical area. This means that almost all sites that would look a certain way on desktops wouldn't look and feel that smooth on a mobile. It would almost always be very, very chunky and very weird looking adaptation when it goes from one device to the other, which means that when we're looking at screen sizes, if the screen size changes of massive amounts, for example, if you had a massive desktop and that had to go to a really small UI of a mobile, it almost always makes sense to have a version adapted for the mobile, to have the version that works according to the mobile, instead of just putting the same thing from here to there. Because when you put the same thing from here to there, you don't have a mouse and a cursor in a mobile, and that means the way people surf across content will almost always be a little bit different. People are directly using their fingers, which isn't always the case with desktops. And also the size and the zooming and the squinting that you need to do to get from one device to the other is just too much headache. The more cleaner way for that is to have breakpoints, meaning we're going to decide on certain pixel values. So for example, if a desktop has a display of 1920 by 1080 pixels, you also decide that at any point when the width of the device goes from 1920 to 300, which is like a mobile display, the way my layout looks is going to change. It's going to adapt and look a little bit different. And this also applies for all of the devices in the middle. So for example, you have a 1920 by 1080 pixel wide desktop and a tablet that isn't 1920 pixels wide but is 600 pixels wide. It might make sense to add a breakpoint that says the moment the device screen size goes down to 600 pixels, change the layout, change the styling in a couple of ways. And this is also the way it goes from one device to the other in every single case. So making any interface adaptable and usable and nice looking for every different kind of device that it is going to be used on is called making it responsive. And now we're going to talk about responsive layouts and adaptive layouts. Mobile devices today make up for the majority of global web traffic. Over 60% worldwide traffic comes from mobiles, and this number just keeps rising as more and more people use mobiles to browse. And in countries like India, mobile traffic can be even higher because many rural places and many places where there isn't a lot of connectivity still have mobiles, but desktops and laptops and full-blown displays are harder to get there. And if your layout only works on desktop, you're ignoring most of your users. Responsive design is a way of building web layouts that adapt smoothly to different screen sizes from small phones to big desktops without you having to need separate websites for each device. You're only changing the layout, not the entirety of the site. And this was first popularized by Ethan Marcotte in a 2010 article titled Responsive Web Design, where Marcotte defined the core ideas that drive responsive web design. So here are the three main key concepts that make responsive design adaptable for all screen sizes even possible. Number one, fluid grids. Grids that use relative units like percentages or ems instead of fixed pixels will have a much easier time being fluid and adaptive to different screen sizes. An element that is set to take up 50% width of a screen will always fill half of the screen no matter what the size of the screen is. Number two, flexible images. Images that resize to fit the space available so they never overflow or stretch awkwardly are flexible images. And the third concept, which is my favorite concept in the whole wide world of responsiveness, is media queries. These are special rules that let you change styles based on the screen width, like switching from a 12-column layout on desktop to an 8-column layout on tablet to a 4-column layout on mobile. And this is exactly the rules that you use to change how a layout looks depending on which device it is being accessed from. Before responsive design became the norm, many sites used adaptive design, which meant building separate versions of a site for different devices, sometimes even on different URLs, like m.yoursite.com would be the one for mobiles. And that approach still exists on sites like Facebook, where m.facebook.com is your automatic redirect when you try to visit the site from a mobile browser. But the responsive design interface has become the standard because it is far more scalable and far user-friendly now in 2026. And so almost all sites that you're going to be working with won't require you to have a separate site only for mobiles. Now you will be able to create responsiveness images inside of the one singular page, one singular site. Responsive design lets a single layout adapt gracefully. From a phone in your hand to a giant monitor on your desk, responsive design isn't optional anymore. It is becoming essential as we start to use this in high numbers and high magnitudes on the web entirely. Alright, the second thing I want to talk about today is breakpoints. What are breakpoints? Why we use breakpoints? Why breakpoints are relevant for responsive design. So, right off the bat, what is a breakpoint? A breakpoint is a screen width where your layout changes. And it's the moment your design says, this screen is too small or this screen is too big. I'm going to adjust my layout now. For example, a 3-column layout might become 2 columns. A sidebar might move below the main content. A horizontal menu might turn into a hamburger menu. Breakpoints are controlling all of these shifts. Even breakpoints have common ranges, so most modern web design roughly follows these specific ranges. From 0 pixels to 767 pixels is a mobile display, from 768 pixels to 1023 pixels is a tablet display, and from 1024 pixels to 1279 pixels is a small desktop. From 1280 pixels to 1535 pixels is a standard desktop. Any desktop that's larger than 1536 pixels is a wide desktop, and different systems will use different numbers, but the idea is almost always the same. We're picking up certain points and realizing all mobiles are going to be served this version of a site, and then we're going to apply a breakpoint and layouts are going to shift a little bit, and then the new version of the site that comes along is going to be used on the tablet. Different systems of design also use different numbers. So for example, if you're using Bootstrap or Material Design or Tailwind CSS, all of which are different style guides and styling libraries, you will see them use different breakpoint numbers. Bootstrap uses 576, 768, 992 and 1200 pixels. Material Design uses 600, 905, 1240 and 1440 sizes for breakpoints of different devices. Tailwind CSS uses 640, 768, 1024, 1280 and 1536 pixels as breakpoints. And these numbers aren't exactly important, but the idea behind them is important, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to look at an average size of a screen and realize whether I'm going to serve it the tablet display layout, or whether I'm serving this the phone display layout, or whether this is going to get the wide monitor display layout. That's what you need to do to make it functional across all screen sizes on the modern web. The most important idea here is you have to design for the content you're working with. Don't design for the iPhone 15 Pro size. Don't design for the iPad size. Don't design for the MacBook size. Design for your content. Here's what that means. You're going to start with your layout, start making the screen slowly narrower, and the moment your screen starts looking cramped is the moment you're going to introduce a media query there or a breakpoint there. This is called content-driven breakpoints, meaning the layout decides when your content is going to change and not the device itself. So it's still catering to each device, but it's looking at your site as a whole. If this site starts looking like a problem at this size, then you're going to add a breakpoint here. If it doesn't look like a problem here, then you're good to go and you're going to keep on going until it's either too wide or too narrow. While making things responsive, there's usually two ways to start designing a site if you're going to use all of the different screen sizes there. Mobile first responsiveness and desktop first responsiveness. Desktop first responsiveness means you're going to design for your larger screens first and then start simplifying the layout for smaller screens. Mobile first layout means you're going to design for the smallest screen first and then start introducing complexity as the screen gets bigger. Mobile first is now becoming the industry standard because most users are on mobile, and it's almost always easier to start with a little bit of space and then expand to take up the size than to start with a lot of content and work super duper hard to kind of get it all filled up and crammed up in this tiny little space. And mobile first layouts are almost always being used by design teams at scale now. Mobile first responsiveness is also a good practice because it forces you to prioritize what really matters. It's easier to add layout features than to remove them, and most users are already on mobile. So if your design says something clearly on a small screen, it will almost always scale up beautifully. Breakpoints aren't actually random numbers. They're thoughtful decision points of when your layout needs to adapt now, when your layout is done with the old layout format, and when your layout needs to get a new one to work professionally on a UI of a really different screen size. Now let's walk through something really practical. How does a layout actually change from a desktop to a mobile UI? And this is where responsive design becomes extremely real. On desktops, you have a 12-column grid. Navigation is horizontal across the top and content may be a 3-column grid, and a sidebar might take up 4 columns. Text is usually constrained to 8 to 10 columns for readability, and everything has space. Multiple columns can work well extremely easily. At a tablet-sized layout, which is basically from 768 pixels to 1024 pixels, the grid often shifts to 8 columns. 3-column grids become 2-column grids, and sidebar usually moves below the main content because there's not a lot of horizontal space available. Navigation stays horizontal, but it becomes a little bit tighter, and layout starts simplifying. Below 768 pixels, your grid becomes a 4-column grid because this is a mobile layout layout now, and it practically behaves like a one-column grid with margins. Cards will stack vertically, sidebar disappears from the side, navigation becomes a hamburger menu, and everything becomes a single column. This is the biggest responsive shift in the history of all responsive shifts. Your stacking order almost always is very critical with responsive design, because when two columns become one, which one comes first? That's the biggest question that comes to UI designers, and you have to think about priority almost always. For example, on desktop you have a hero image on the left and a form on the right, and the question becomes which one is going to be shown to the user first. Is the user going to see the image first or the form first? On mobile, you almost always use the image first and then the form in the exact same reading order. But if the right column contains key text that the users might see before the form makes sense, then you might stack the text first. Stacking is not random, it's strategically deciding which content is the first that needs to be shown to the user on a limited mobile based area. And some elements don't actually move, they just transform, because responsive design is not about shrinking things, it's about making the right content be structured in the right place. Sometimes components will completely change from horizontal navigation to hamburger navigation, sidebars to drawer or modals, data table to a cards list, multi-column form to a single column form. Responsive design is about adapting the structure and not just resizing boxes to shrink their size. So the real question when doing responsive design is never will this stack or not. The real question is always in which order are we stacking these things? What gets simplified? What gets removed? What needs to have a little bit more complexity? All of the responsive design decisions are strategic decisions and not resizing decisions in practicality. What can be transformed to become something better for mobiles? And that level of thinking is exactly what separates basic responsive layouts from thoughtful responsive ones. Alright, welcome to module 5. So far we've covered foundations, grids, spacings and responsive behavior, and now we're moving to something really practical and really useful: layout patterns. What are layout patterns, Veera? Why are we talking about this? So layout patterns are proven structural solutions that are reusable and are arranged commonly with content across the internet to solve common UI design problems. Just like software has design patterns, UI design has layout patterns, and they exist because the same problem appears over and over again while making similar kinds of UIs, and certain structures will consistently deliver and work better than the others. And these structures that consistently work better not just for you but for designers across the globe are commonly reused layout patterns that you can now learn to fast track your journey to becoming a pro in UI UX design. When you learn layout patterns, you stop trying to reinvent the whole wheel and recognize this is a pricing section problem, this is a dashboard layout problem, this is a marketing hero problem, and then you're able to apply the right kinds of structures that suit your particular kind of problem, giving you the same or better results faster than you could ever do as a beginner who's just starting in a market that's already quite competitive. Now let's talk about why patterns matter. Without layout patterns, every layout needs a separate new starting point and it becomes harder than it should be. You're redesigning common structures from scratch and your work becomes completely inconsistent. But when you have layout patterns, you design faster, your layouts feel familiar, and users understand your intent instantly because they've seen this layout pattern used across the internet before. So how do we learn these layout patterns properly? Well, as we go through each section, we're going to ask ourselves these questions. Where have I seen these before? How did it work well? When did it work well? And when did it feel confusing? And the fastest way to master layout patterns is to notice said layout patterns everywhere you go across the internet. In the apps you use every day, in the landing pages you're using every day, in the different websites and apps you're visiting every day, whatever your experience on the internet is, has particularly useful, particularly effective, efficient layout patterns. Your job as a beginner is to start spotting them quickly so that you can understand what common solutions exist for common patterns in UI UX design across the web. Once you start seeing these patterns, you really can't unsee them, and that's when your layout skills are starting to level up. Alright, let's talk about the core page level layout patterns that are present everywhere that all of you need to know without a doubt. These are the page level layout patterns you will see again and again in your UI design journey, and when you recognize your design patterns, they become much faster and much more intentional and help speed up your own design skills as a UI UX designer. The first pattern I want to talk about is the F pattern. The F pattern comes from eye tracking research by the Nielsen-Norman group. On text heavy pages, users tend to read across the top, scan down to the left side, and then read across again in the lower down handle. And this forms an F or sometimes even an E, and this is a pattern that's used repetitively by people over and over again when they're working on the web. This is best and most often used for articles, search results, product listings, documentation, design implications, and you can physically apply it by putting important content at the top and the left, keeping key actions near the top and making the first paragraph really strong. The next pattern I want to talk about is the Z pattern. The Z pattern works for pages with less text and more visuals because users will scan from top left to top right, then a diagonal down, and then from bottom left to bottom right. This is best for landing pages, marketing homepages, and just almost every common site which doesn't have a lot of text uses these over and over again. The typical placement in Z pattern layouts goes: the logo has to be at the top left, the navigation has to be at the top right, supporting content at the bottom left, and call to action at the bottom right. This is used way too much with spacious luxury home pages, landing pages that take up a lot of space and are mostly used for a premium product. They use the entirety of the screen space. Number 2, the Holy Grail layout. This is the most basic 3-column layout in the whole wide world, with the header at the top, the footer at the bottom, main content in the center, a left sidebar and the right sidebar. This is called the Holy Grail layout, the most basic layout you'll ever learn as a UI UX designer, and it's used really commonly even across the internet right now. Historically, it used to be hard to build in CSS, which is the styling language for web pages, but now it has become easier with layout tools that are available in 2026, and it is best for blogs, documentations, content heavy platforms where the center column is the hero and the sidebars support it. Alright, let's now talk about the card layouts. Cards are self-contained content blocks, and each card usually has an image, a title, text and a button. Cards work because they chunk information together, and you see them everywhere, from Pinterest to Airbnb to Trello to material design. And the key rule with card layouts is you're going to keep the structure consistent so users can actually scan quickly when they're moving through your site. An advanced move on this would be to feature one larger card to create hierarchy amongst the smaller cards. Number 4, sidebar layouts. This is a 2-column layout with a wider main content section and a narrower sidebar section, and it is used for settings pages, dashboards, documentations, e-commerce filtering, and here's an important thing you need to remember while working with sidebar layouts. The sidebar should not, cannot, never should in its whole entire lifetime compete with the main content visually on the whole section. On mobile, it becomes a drawer or it stacks below your main content. It never overtakes or competes with your main content. Number 5, the dashboard layout. This is a modular grid of data blocks, and it shows you metrics, charts, tables, alerts. And here's the basic principle behind dashboard layouts. You need to use size to show priority, you need to use colors to show alerts, and you need to keep your spacing very consistent. Also, make sure to not overload it with data because dashboards are already content heavy, and if you start overloading them with data, it's really going to be a hellhole in one tiny little place. The biggest mistake I see people making with dashboard layouts is trying to show everything at once. A good dashboard shows what the users need to make decisions and not the entire database in one dump. When you master these page level patterns, you stop guessing and you start choosing your structure intentionally. Let's talk about some navigation patterns now, because navigation layout directly affects whether the user can find what they need at all. The first type of navigation is the top navigation bar, which is the desktop standard. This is a horizontal bar at the top containing a logo, the main navigation links, the utility actions such as search, profile, and notifications, and are best for web apps, marketing sites, and products with fewer than 7 to 8 main items. It's familiar and efficient and highly used across the internet in desktop first layouts. The next navigation type that we're talking about is the left sidebar navigation, which is common in complex apps like admin panels, design tools, IDEs, and expertise enterprise dashboards. It has many advantages like supporting many items at once, supporting hierarchy, which is clearly visible, and always being visible. But there is a solid trade-off that I think about a lot in my own journey as a designer, which is that it takes up horizontal space, so your aesthetic, designer, creative juices can't really flow on that side of the screen, and that's a little bit of a limiting factor for me personally when I'm trying to design things. The next type of navigation is the bottom navigation, which is the mobile standard, and it's primarily used in mobiles and apps first. It's recommended by Apple's human interface guidelines and material designs, and it works because it's easier to reach with thumbs and better for large phones. The best practice with these bottom mobile navigation bars is to have a maximum of 3 to 5 items, and if you start increasing number of items from that point on, it becomes a really difficult thing for users to squint and see. Alright, the next navigation type that I want to talk about is the mega menu, which is a large drop down panel with multiple columns, many links, and sometimes even images. It's used by e-commerce sites, major publications, and almost always requires a clear common structure of clear columns, strong alignment, and careful visual hierarchy. So these are the things you might want to keep in mind before getting a mega menu with your entire UI. Only get it when you have an amount of hierarchical elements where it makes sense, otherwise it's just overkill. Alright, now we're talking about form layout patterns, because forms are extremely sensitive to layout. If you have poor layout, you're going to get a lot of confusion and drop off from the user's side. So the first type of form layout is the single column form, which is the best default. It has research from CXL Institute and others showing showing that it reduces form errors, it increases completion speed, and it reduces confusion. Avoid using side-by-side fields unless they're conceptually one unit, for example, month and day, or city and zip code, which are kind of similar and need to be in the same category together. The second form layout pattern is the field grouping and sections. Long forms should be divided into personal details, shipping addresses, and payment information. And you can use extra white space here, you can use subheadings here, you can use cards or dividers here. Grouping elements of similar sections together reduces intimidation from the sheer number of things you need to fill out in a form. Now let's talk about label positions. So the best practice is always to have labels above the fields and avoid placeholder only labels, which basically disappear when the user starts typing, or labels inside fields which also have readability and usability issue when users actually start using it. Why? Because placeholders disappear when you start typing and users forget what the field is actually about, and it leads to so many accessibility issues that I don't want to get into at this point, but you're going to have to optimize your site for screen readers and for people with multiple disabilities, and in those cases bad label positioning will always kill you, will always kill your form, because forms are the place where you have your user interacting with you, where you have a conversion happening, and it's a really bad idea to alienate this huge audience simply because you couldn't place your label positions right. So this is a really important one even for accessibility, and this is something that you need to get right every single time. Now let's talk about some hero section layout patterns. The hero section is the most valuable area on a page. Users will decide in seconds whether to stay or leave depending on what your hero section looks like. It is the hero, as the name suggests. It is the most important part. This is where all of the fancy magic happens, which is exactly why the layout patterns for hero sections are super duper important to think about as a UI UX design beginner. The first kind of hero section that I want to talk about is the centered hero, where everything is centered, including the headline, subheadline, and also the call to action button, because it feels super clean, super symmetrical, and completely brand focused. The next kind of hero pattern is split hero with half text and half images. You have got text on the left and images on the right, and it's super common in software as a service or SaaS applications because it feels dynamic and very product focused, because you have an image and you have text to support that image. So they go very, really powerfully together in SaaS landing pages specifically. The third kind of hero pattern is image heavy or full bleed hero, which is a large background image or a video with text layered on top. It feels immersive, it feels cinematic, and it feels premium, and it requires a lot of strong contrast control to get right. If you don't get your contrast right, the video's background colors will almost always clash with your text colors, specifically white and black, and it will be a hell to implement. So if you are really strong with your contrast control, that's when I'd recommend using this one. If you're using a very cinematic site or a site which is immersive and feeling premium, that's when this kind of hero section works, but it also requires advanced contrast control and a good eye for seeing where your color contrast is not meeting WCAG guidelines. If you don't yet know what WCAG is, here is the world's easiest WCAG crash course. But if you don't have contrast control, regardless of whether you know about WCAG or not, I would not recommend going into this as a first time beginner, because you will mess up the contrast, and just try not to use it with a client if you're starting to experiment in the first place. Alright, so we talked about hero layout patterns, but the most important hero section rule that I can give you in this video is your users must always understand who you are, what you offer, and what to do next in under 5 seconds. And if a user has to study your hero, try to figure out the answers to these questions, it has already failed. Component level patterns are exactly where real usability lives. Page structure is what sets the stage for the entirety of your UI, which is why layout patterns and getting them right becomes so important. Components are what decides whether a layout will actually succeed or not. And speaking of success and failure, I want to talk about layout anti-patterns, which are common failures or mistakes that UI UX designers get into all the time, because we've talked about what to do, and I also want to get into what not to do. And these are layout mistakes I've seen over and over again, experienced designers have talked about over and over again, and you need to know to not make over and over again. Number one, wall of text, which is a giant block of text with no spacing, no subheadings, and no visual breaks. It is exhausting to read, and you can fix it by adding subheadings every 3 to 4 paragraphs, using bullet points for lists, adding images or pull quotes, and increasing spacing. Because if it looks heavy, users will not read it, they will drop off, and that's not what we want in your first site as a UI UX designer. Alright, now I want to talk about the orphaned element. So imagine you have a 3-column grid with 7 cards. The last row has 1 lonely card, and it looks super awkward. So you have a couple of solutions to go around with that. You can either adjust the grid, use a masonry layout, or feature the last card as full width. Don't ignore the orphaned card, fix the structure, otherwise it looks really weird and clunky and shows you're a beginner who's just getting into this. The next one is inconsistent spacing. This one is a subtle but deadly killer. For example, if you have 20 pixels of spacing above one heading and 17 pixels above another heading and 24 pixels somewhere else, nothing is congruent and everything everything looks obviously wrong, but everything remains slightly off until you fix your spacing scale, which almost always is recommended to be the 8-point system. When you stick to defined values and when you be systematic, because consistency is professionalism in UX design and in layout patterns too. The next mistake that I see all the time is cluttered hero sections, where you have too many elements in the hero section competing for attention. For example, you've got multiple headlines, multiple call to action buttons, multiple visuals, banners stacked on top of each other, and the result is nothing stands out. The easiest fix I can give you for this is to have one primary headline, one primary CTA, one strong visual, and edit your content ruthlessly. Because if you don't, users will, and they will skip on your entire site, which is the last thing we want right now. Alright, the next one is the mobile afterthought, which is designing for desktops first and then just shrinking it as mobile comes to you as an afterthought, which is really problematic. And some common problems include getting the stacking order of elements wrong, having super tiny text to kind of scale down for mobiles, buttons just too closed and clamped up together, poor spacing, poor white space. And the easiest fix for this is to have your mobile first designs as the real redesign. You have to reconsider what comes first, what can be removed, what must stay, what's an essential, what's not an essential, and make strategic decisions depending on your content. Mobile cannot be your least thought about afterthought. It has to be a priority. And the last anti-pattern that I see with layouts all the time is ignoring the fold. The fold is the area which is visible without scrolling. And two mistakes that I see all the time is people ignore the fold completely, or they try to cram everything above it. So the truth is users will scroll, but they need a reason to start scrolling. And what you have above the fold on the first screen should be explaining what the page is about, making the user interested in the contents of after the scroll. So you need to make sure the things that are at the top of the scroll are very interesting enough for the user to want to scroll. Communicate value and give a clear next step, and then your users will scroll naturally. Anti-patterns are a powerful thing to study, because once you start learning to see them, you stop making them and your layouts instantly improve completely, and you go from a beginner to a pro designer in so much less effort than you would otherwise have to go through for the same amount of results. Welcome to the final module, where we're going to move on from something that separates intermediate designers to advanced designers: motion. Because layout isn't just static anymore. Print media was static, but layouts, websites, UIs are getting interactive and full of animation and motion, so it's really important that you get the hang of that as well. In digital products, layout changes when users click, scroll, open menus, submit forms, or do anything else that is interactive. And motion is how those changes happen, because motion is a layout over time. Motion also communicates spacing. Animation helps users understand where things live. If a sidebar slides in from the left, users ultimately understand that this exists to the left of the screen even when it is hidden. If you've got a modal coming from a button at the bottom of the button, users automatically understand this modal lives below the button when it's not animating or not visible. Animation shows what moved, where it moved. Without motion, changes feel random, and with motion, changes feel logical. Here's the golden rule of UI motion that absolutely every one of you needs to know. Animation is not decoration. Animation is strategic. Every animation must answer, what does this interface teach the user about the interface? And if the answer is nothing, remove the animation. Now we're going to talk about some main kinds of animations you'll encounter in your day-to-day life. For example, number one, easing, which is how motion feels. Easing controls acceleration and deceleration. When you ease out, it's a fast start and slow end, which is the most natural for elements entering. When you ease in, it's a slow start and a fast end, which is often used for elements leaving. When you ease in out, it slow starts and ends, and it's good for movement across the screen. And when you've got linear motion, it is constant speed and feels robotic, which is rarely the ideal world. Real world objects don't move linearly, which is why your UI shouldn't move linearly either. Now let's talk about duration, which is critical, because timing is critical in all animation. Most UI animations should be 150 milliseconds to 400 milliseconds, and some common guidelines are a hover effect that can go to 100 milliseconds, button feedback switch should stay in 150 milliseconds, page transitions should stay in 300 milliseconds, and complex animations can take up to 600 milliseconds. If you've got an animation going too fast, users really don't understand what's happening, and if it's too slow, users get bored, annoyed, and leave your site. Here's an accessibility point that you might want to think about, which is reduced motion, because some users will experience motion sensitivity, and fast or large animations will cause them dizziness, nausea, and discomfort. So modern systems support reduced motion preferences as well, and your designs must have a section that respects that. And if an animation is essential, keep it. Otherwise, have a button that says turn off unnecessary animations, which get rid of the animations that aren't mainly important for the UI to function. It is the way you comply with accessibility. If you've got an animation that just needs to be done, make sure to reduce its distance, reduce its duration, and avoid large parallax or zoom effects, because motion should enhance usability and not harm it. Advanced layout thinking includes motion, because layout isn't just where things are, it's also how things move. Let's now talk about layout in design terms, because design systems have changed changed how modern products are built. A design system is a shared set of reusable components, spacing rules, typography styles, and layout guidelines, and it helps teams design and build consistently. And at the center of every design system is a layout. Layout is the foundation of every design system. Every mature design system defines a grid structure, which is columns, gutters, margins, points, spacing scales, which is often the 8-point system, a type scale, which is H1, H2, body text caption, and page level layout templates. Layout is not just optional inside a system, it is the core essential of the skeleton of the system itself. Now let's look at real world design systems and layouts and how major systems approach layout as a whole. Material design uses flexible grids, 4 columns on compact screens and 12 columns on large screens, and it defines layout regions like navigation rails, navigation drawers, main content, supporting panel, and remains very structured and modular. Apple's human interface guidelines are also similar in terms of standardizing design systems. Apple mainly defines layout around safe areas, and safe areas ensure your content doesn't clash with notches and content avoids home indicators, and most importantly, your system UI doesn't overlap with important elements. This layout adapts to hardware constraints automatically. The Lightning design system uses a 12-column grid, defines spacing tokens, and focuses on enterprise clarity with very systematic and consistent design spacings. The Carbon design system is also very interesting because it is based on an 8-pixel mini unit and has a strong spacing system with modular layout structure. So what does this mean for you? When working inside a design system, you do not invent random spacing, you do not invent random grid lines, you do not invent the spacing scale or the type system or layout rules. And if none exist, creating a minimal layout system is the highest impact contribution you can make. Because layout systems don't just make things look good, they make teams move structurally and faster. Into 2026, the devices, technologies, and all the space that is being used with layouts is changing super duper fast, and that means we as designers have to start thinking about the new kinds of layouts that are emerging because we are in 2026. The first topic that I want to talk about is foldable or dual screen devices. When you have got devices like Samsung Galaxy Fold or any kind of fold that flips, opens, or the Microsoft Surface Duo, it becomes really important to think about the new constraint that they're just giving us, which is the hinge in the middle of the screen. A layout can now span 2 screens physically, which also means important content must not sit under the hinge. It can't be hidden in the center of the page by the hinge, and your layout itself must detect whether this is a foldable or unfoldable device. Dual pane layouts can become powerful if you've got text on one side and descriptions and visuals on the other side. And now it's becoming like a tablet that can split itself, and so designers have to think more and more about panels and not just columns. The second kind of new and interesting technology change that I'm just seeing in 2026 is spatial and AR interfaces. With devices like Apple Vision Pro or Meta Quest, 3D and AR isn't just a thing that is going to be in the future. It's in the reality, and it's in 2026 right now. Layout is no longer flat, it actually exists in 3D spaces. But that introduces new challenges because backgrounds are now unpredictable. Text must stay readable at different distances and contrast has to be stronger. And touch targets, most importantly, need to get larger as we're going through this journey. And you start arranging objects in depth and not just height and width. This is now already 3D in layouts, and you have to think about the third dimension as well, really practically, because AR is now more real than it has ever been in the history of technology. The third change I'm seeing happen so easily inside of our world is variable fonts and advanced typography, which didn't even used to be an existing concept, and now it's just widespread everywhere. Variable fonts allow multiple weights, multiple widths, and multiple styles all inside one font file, which means instead of just shrinking texts as the screens get smaller, you can make headings narrower, you can adjust weight of the text dynamically, and you can fine-tune typography for each singular layout. Layouts and typography are merging together to make one incredibly responsive way of moving across the internet. And responsiveness in typography itself is becoming so much more precise than it ever was, which is going to have severe implications when you just take basic layout knowledge and not consider variable fonts and advanced typography to be a concept that is here, that is already in full scale. The next thing that I saw that I want to talk about in this video is AI generated and personalized layouts, because some people are beginning to experiment with layouts that adapt to user behavior, engagement level, and even feature usage. For example, reordering navigation based on usage, adjusting information density to advanced users, and surfacing frequently used tools. Layouts may become less fixed and more adaptive, and not just responsive to screen sizes but responsive to the person using it. So the big shift is this: for years layout has always meant columns, grid, breakpoints, and now it also includes hinges and depth and the user behavior itself. Personalization is becoming a core principle as we approach this new world of layouts, and the core principles remain the same: hierarchy, spacing, balance, clarity are always going to be important, but the contexts are expanding and great designers adapt with the expanding contexts. Alright, let's talk about the design process now. How would you approach a design problem in 2026? Because we're at the end and let's get something practical to work with. How do you approach a layout problem from scratch? Well, the first step is to start with the content. Before ever opening up Figma, list every piece of content that must appear, group related items and rank them by importance. This gives you content hierarchy. Layout is simply the visual expression of that hierarchy. And if the hierarchy is unclear in your head, the layout will become unclear on screen. The next step is to sketch first, whether it's small or big, because thumbnail sketching is extremely powerful. Drawing a tiny layout box on paper and filling it up with the contents and the structures that you're planning on with your UI is always going to be much simpler than going to Figma, getting lost in the blank frame paralysis and losing 2 to 3 hours of your precious time just looking at the screen, not coming up with any clear idea at all. Draw a tiny layout box on paper. And why am I saying tiny? Because small sketches for structural thinking prevent pixel tweaking and keep you focused on the composition. You can also try 10 layout variations in 10 minutes and explore how 10 new ideas on paper come about in 10 simple minutes while it takes 45 minutes from scratch on a design. Number 3, start with extremes. Don't begin in the middle. Design for the smallest screen, which is the mobile, or the widest screen, which is the large desktop. Why? Because extremes reveal structure, and if your layout works at both extremes, the middle sizes are always going to be easier to solve. Number 4, validate with real content. Placeholder content lies and real content breaks things. So it is your job as a UI UX designer to be testing things with long headlines, translated text, real product images, user generated content. Did you know that German text can be 30 to 40% longer than English? User images may be tall, wide, cropped badly, and anything can happen. Putting out real content is the real stress test, because if your content survives that, your layout is already strong. Step 5 is to refine your spacing at the end, because structure first takes care of your column spans, structure first takes care of your element order, structure first takes care of your breakpoints, and structure first takes care of your stacking logic. Spacing, when it comes second, is easier to adapt in a solid structure than to do all of your spacing and then be worried about where do I fit this structurally important piece of content. Step 6 is going to be to get your feedback early, because layouts will behave differently in real browsers and on real devices. Show your work to developers, other designers, and even users if possible, because the earlier you catch layout issues, the cheaper and easier it is to fix those issues. Good layout isn't just magic. It's not some magical instinct that God gives to you on a Sunday. It's a clear hierarchical thinking, structural hierarchy, iterations, testing, refinement, and mind-numbing layers of making sure the right thing is strategically put at the right place. If you follow this process consistently, your layouts will improve dramatically, and that's how you approach any layout problem in the real world. Congratulations on completing this crash course on layouts in UI UX design. Let's take a final look at everything we've learned in this video, everything that you're going home with today. In the first module, we learned about foundations, what a layout really is, why it matters, and the big 5 principles of layout design, which are hierarchy, alignment, proximity, balance, and white space. These are the core rules behind any layout which works successfully. Then we went into grids and took a deeper dive into column grids, modular grids, 8-point system grids, and practical column span decisions. We learned that grids are not cages, they're actually guides. In module 3, we went through spacing and rhythm, where we explored vertical rhythm, margin versus padding, typography spacing, information density, and you now understand spacing that creates order, clarity, and gives strength to the UI, as opposed to being a random piece of extra space available that God knows why just got left behind. In module 4, we learned responsive design, breakpoints, mobile first strategies, layout transformation across devices, fluid typography, and spacing. You learned that responsive design is about strategically structuring the content that we already have, instead of just trying to shrink it down to fit the next device that is given to you. In module 5, we learned about layout patterns. We cataloged the F pattern, the Z pattern, the card layouts, the sidebar and dashboard layouts, navigation and form patterns, and even common anti-patterns in layouts in UI UX design. You can now recognize reusable structured solutions in all of layouts in UI UX design. In module 6, we learned about advanced concepts and explored motion as a spatial communication tool, layout in design systems, accessibility in layout, and emerging contents like foldable and spatial interfaces, and a responsive design process and how to do it in a real world problem. And you now see layout as a system and not just composition. So now the obvious question is, what comes next? Because layout is deep and this course gives you the foundation of everything you need to know to get started. Now the real growth starts when you analyze every interface you use, sketch out your layouts before getting into a design tool, test with real content, and ask, why does this feel clear? Why does something feel crowded? What is the thing I need to add or remove to make this function better? And the best designers are not just skilled in theory, they are curious, reverse engineering great products out there and questioning everything. And it is with the knowledge you've got today that you can go and be the same. And I'll see you in the next one.